Hey guys, we're back and we're in the Encyclopedia of the Ancient World, and we're going to be talking about life in early Egypt, okay? Lots of different things and lots of different aspects of life in Egypt, but farming was one of the most important, okay? It was the backbone of Egyptian society. The farmland was all along the Nile River, where the soil was very rich and very fertile, and they were able to grow an abundance of crops and able to grow more than they could even eat, okay? But that was also important because the extra was used for many things. The extra grain was paid in taxes to the kings. It was used to pay for the servants and the workers. And it also financed building projects because, they would export it. And so farming was hugely important. So much so there was a whole cycle of farming. They called it a farming calendar. And this was based on the rise and fall of the Nile River. So it started in the spring. In the spring, the rain and the snow would start to melt from the mountains of Ethiopia, and it'd flow into the river and swell the river. Then you would have inundation. This is where the river actually starts to flood. The Nile would overflow its banks. This usually happens somewhere around July, and it would flood the whole entire valley. And the flooding was important, and they kept an eye on things, because if the flooding was too low, there would be a very poor harvest and possibly famine. However, if the flooding was too high, it could flood the villages and destroy homes and cause lots of death and chaos. So the flood was very important, and they kept an eye on it. After the flood, usually somewhere as the waters receded, somewhere around October, there was just this silt that was left. It's a thick layer of fertile mud in the area. And this is when the farmers would sow the fields. They would sow wheat so they could make bread. They would sow barley so they could create beer. And they would sow by throwing the seeds out into this muddy silt and then herding the sheep over it. And the sheep would step on all these seeds and push them down into the ground. After this, they would wait for the harvest, right? The harvest occurred sometime between March and June. And it was, again, extremely important because they had a very narrow window. Everyone harvested with sickles, all the people, everyone. Sometimes it was so important to get the harvest done that the army would come and help them. They had to finish before the summer heat for a couple reasons. One, because that summer heat would just beat down on those crops and destroy it. But also because that is when they were able to repair the irrigation ditches. And they had to make sure that got done because the irrigation systems were extremely important. These would help control some of the flooding, but also leave water in the areas for them when they needed it after the floods receded. And these irrigation systems went as far back as the pre-dynastic times, early Egypt. The land was divided into fields with irrigation ditches between the fields. And then every summer, as the summer heat came and dried things up, they could go in there and repair those irrigation systems. Eventually, somewhere in the New Kingdom, they created what is called shadoofs, and this was a device that was able to lift the water out of the river and be able to use for different purposes. So they did all this, and then we had the harvest, right? The harvest was important. The harvest is the end goal, getting the material. And the grain, after they harvested, would be loaded onto the donkeys and taken to the threshing floor. From there, it would be separate the grain from the stalk. And this was done by cows or donkeys, again, trampling all over it. They used their animals to help them a lot. Once they had the grain, they would winnow it, they would throw it in the air, and this would separate the grain from the straw and the chaff. And everybody had to pay taxes to the king, and that was a tenth of whatever crops you grew. So you had to pay a tenth of everything to the king. Some of the other foods that they had in this time, or different crops that were grown, was flax, and they used that for a lot of their linen. And they grew and had different vegetables and fruits. They had beans and lentils, onions, garlic, lettuce, cucumbers, leeks, melons, grapes, pomegranates, and dates and figs, all in the area. They also used animals, not just to help them with their crops, but as food as well. They had grazing animals, which were sheep, goats, pigs, and cows. However, the cows were generally only affordable by the rich, and they would use them for meat and milk. Some of the other animals, especially along the edge of the Nile there, that they would either capture or take their eggs and kind of have like farms for them, domesticated farms, were geese, ducks, and pigeons, used again for food. If you weren't a farmer, though, there was many other jobs you could be doing. There was skilled craftsmen of all sorts. These craftsmen were well paid and usually highly respected members of the community. They had very simple tools and techniques, but produced very high quality work. Most of these craftsmen worked for the kings or the pharaohs and or other important people, the priests, and they worked on tombs and temple projects and in the palaces and different things. And then you had skilled workers, carpenters, some of the local wood that they would use with this sycamore, fig, and palm, and that was just kind of the general work, general skilled carpenters. But then the more important carpenters, the more high quality carpenters would deal with the imported wood, ebony and cedar, and they would make, statues and furniture out of this. You also had metalsmiths and jewelers, and both of these groups of people worked together because they used a lot of the same materials. They worked with copper and bronze and silver and gold, and they used electrum, which is a mix of gold and silver. And they would hammer these items into shape, and they would make models and statues by casting metal, melting the metal and pouring it into some type of stone or pottery shapes, and they did great work. Another job you could have would be as a potter, and they worked with the clay, and they would make carved pots out of stone, and some decorated with what's called faience, which is a glaze. It looks like glass when it's dried. Then you actually had glass workers too, right? These glass workers would make a shape from clay and then dip the bowl into the melted glass, and then once it dried, they would scrape the clay out of it, and then you would have a glass bowl. We found a lot of this information, I say we, the archaeologists, not me personally, from a site we already talked about at Deir el Medina. This is where they found a village that survived, right? There's an excavated village where they learned a lot about the different craftsmen from. It was the home to where the men and their families lived who were building the tombs of the Valley of the Kings. They were wealthier than the average craftsman, though, and so there was a little bit of difference there, but they also made tombs for themselves, and that's how we know they were a little wealthier. They were usually paid in goods: grain, fish, salt, beer, oil, etc. At the tombs, though, they lived in their houses while working on the tombs, and we've got a lot of records and information that were discovered from this area, and it shows that they had an 8-hour day with a long midday break, and they had one day off every 10 days, and they would get time off for different festivals. The information also shows that they worked in 2 different groups, one on either side of the pyramid, or the tomb that they were working on. There was also a foreman in charge of each group, and then they had scribes that kept meticulous records, which we know and were used to find all this information. And these scribes would control and record all the material and tools that were being used and taken out. They recorded the attendance and wages. And then they showed that there was 2 other men who their whole job was to look after the storerooms and make sure the items didn't, disappear. They all worked together. The scribe to record everything, and there was a very strict security system for all of it. Also, there was kind of everyday jobs that people would do, from the lowliest people up to even some of the wealthier people, because it was necessities, one of them being baking bread. It was an important diet for everybody in Egypt, and it came in different shapes and sizes. The rich people usually had white bread and had some type of sweet pastries in fancy shapes, where the poorer people had a coarse brown bread. And they would be made all of it in their homes. Then they also had to have drinks every day, right? Something to drink. Beer was the most popular drink in Egypt. Its process was bread and grain soaked in water, and that would become like a mash. They would mash it up and become a mash, and then they put it through the sieve, And then whatever was left, they would let it sit and ferment, and then they would drink that. Sometimes it would have spices to it or different things to give it just a little bit of a flavor. They also had wine made by grapes, but again, this was usually reserved for people of higher wealth. And then, of course, water. Then everyone learned how to work with reeds as well. Lots of reeds all along the Nile River. They were used for boats. They were used for roofing material. They would be dried and woven into mats for baskets and chests and sandals. And then, of course, the papyrus, right? They would cut them into little thin strips, laid out and dried and put together and used for scrolls. Then, as we talked about before, the mud. Everybody had to learn how to deal with the mud, and they usually would use mud for different things. Farmers would use it to grow their crops and stuff in. Everybody would use it to make bricks. Everything that was built pretty much from mud bricks. And lastly, we had servants and slaves, okay? Before the New Kingdom, there was almost no slaves. However, there were servants, but they were truly not slaves. They were servants. They were paid and provided with food and things. They were usually reserved for the rich and helped with the chores and everyday life stuff that the rich people just didn't want to do. However, after the New Kingdom, where Egypt became super powerful, the prisoners of war were captured and truly made into slaves. And the slave life varied greatly depending on where you got put. So, you might be forced into a quarry or a building site, and that would be a really tough, really hard, strenuous job, and you might not last very long in that. Or you could get lucky and get to an easier job where you became a servant or a slave in a home or at one of the temple sites and just kind of doing household chores or, kind of cleaning up different things. And so that would be an easier life for you. So all this just kind of shows kind of some everyday normal life stuff that happened in Egypt, from different jobs they had to different skills they needed to make wine, and food processes and things. So just make sure you read the material, and hopefully you read it and enjoy it. Thanks.